Have you ever found yourself sitting next to your spouse in the same room, the television on, the house quiet, and suddenly realizing how little you've spoken all day? Not because there was a fight. Not because anything big happened. Just a quiet distance that seemed to grow on its own. Many couples in later life experience this and wonder how they got here. After decades together, after raising children, building a life, surviving hardships, it can feel confusing and even painful to sense that something is slipping away. And most people assume that when marriages struggle in old age, it must be because of health issues, money worries, or simply growing apart over time. But research and real-life experience tell a very different story. Marriages don't usually break down in later years because of one dramatic event. They weaken through patterns, small moments repeated over and over, often without either partner realizing the damage being done. These moments live in everyday conversations, in tone of voice, in how concerns are raised, in how disagreements begin. What makes this especially important for older couples is that time feels more precious. There's less energy for endless conflict and less patience for emotional strain. Yet the habits that quietly harm connection can become deeply ingrained after years together. Today, I want to talk with you about 5 common patterns that slowly destroy marriages in old age, not because couples don't care, but because they don't see what's happening while it's happening. These patterns are not about blame. They are about awareness. And the good news is that once you recognize them, you can change them. Even small changes can bring warmth and closeness back into a long marriage. Let's begin with something that seems simple but carries enormous weight. It's how conversations start, especially difficult ones. Many disagreements don't fail because of what is said, but because of how they begin. This first pattern is often called a harsh startup. You might recognize it as that sharp tone that comes out before you've even finished your first sentence. Maybe it sounds like frustration that's been sitting there all day. Maybe it comes from being tired, in pain, or feeling unappreciated. Instead of saying how you feel, the conversation opens with blame. You never listen anymore. You always leave things for me to handle. Why do you have to be so difficult? What's happening in these moments is not a discussion. It's an emotional alarm. When a conversation begins with criticism, the other person's body reacts before their mind does. Their heart rate rises, stress hormones surge, and their ability to listen calmly drops. This matters even more in later life, when stress affects the body more quickly and recovery takes longer. You may think your spouse is ignoring you or being stubborn, but often they simply feel attacked and overwhelmed. At that point, problem-solving becomes almost impossible. Many older couples say, "But I've earned the right to speak my mind by now." And while honesty is important, delivery still matters. A soft beginning invites connection. A harsh one pushes it away. Over time, repeated harsh startups teach both partners to brace themselves before every serious conversation. Instead of curiosity, there's tension. Instead of openness, there's defensiveness. And that leads directly into the second pattern that damages marriages deeply over time. This second pattern is far more serious and far more painful. It's contempt. Contempt shows up when frustration hardens into superiority. It's the eye roll when your spouse talks. The sarcastic comment disguised as humor. The sigh that says, "Here we go again." In long marriages, contempt often grows quietly from years of unresolved disappointments. You may not even realize it's there because it feels normal, almost automatic. What makes contempt so destructive is the message it sends. It doesn't say, "You did something that upset me." It says, "You are the problem." For older couples, this can be especially damaging because identity and self-worth become more fragile with age. Retirement, health changes, and loss can already leave people feeling less capable or valued. Contempt from a spouse cuts deeply because it comes from the person whose respect matters most. Research shows that contempt doesn't just hurt emotionally, it affects physical health. Couples who interact with contempt experience higher stress, weaker immune systems, and more frequent illness. But beyond the science, Think about how it feels to be looked down on by someone you've shared your life with. Over time, contempt drains the emotional account of a marriage. Every sarcastic remark, every dismissive gesture is a withdrawal. And eventually, there's nothing left to draw on when times get hard. Many people believe they can undo contempt with a simple apology. But apologies only work when they're paired with genuine respect. Without that, they sound hollow. And when contempt is present, it almost always triggers the next damaging pattern, one that feels instinctive and justified but quietly blocks all repair. That pattern is defensiveness. Defensiveness is the reflex to protect yourself when you feel accused. Your spouse says they feel lonely, and you respond by explaining why it's not your fault. They mention feeling ignored, and you list all the reasons you're under stress. You may think you're defending your character, but what your partner hears is denial. They hear that their feelings don't matter as much as your explanation. In later life, defensiveness often increases because people feel more vulnerable. Physical limitations, memory changes, and dependence on each other can heighten sensitivity. When a concern is raised, it can feel like a judgment on your entire life or your worth as a partner. So the instinct is to push back, to correct, to justify. But when both partners do this, conversations turn into battles over who is right instead of efforts to understand each other. Defensiveness blocks responsibility. And without responsibility, nothing changes. Problems repeat. Frustration builds. Resentment settles in. Over time, couples stop trying to resolve issues because every attempt ends in the same exhausting exchange. The emotional energy required to keep engaging starts to feel too heavy, and that's when something else begins to happen, often without words. This is where the story naturally moves next, because when criticism, contempt, and defensiveness pile up, one partner often reaches a breaking point. Instead of arguing, they withdraw. Instead of defending, they shut down. The conversation doesn't escalate anymore because one person simply checks out. And while that might feel like relief in the moment, it opens the door to another powerful force that affects marriages in later years in ways many people don't expect. And as we continue, it becomes clear that these patterns don't exist in isolation. They feed into one another, shaping how safe or unsafe a marriage feels, especially when emotional closeness matters more than ever. When one partner begins to shut down emotionally, it rarely looks dramatic at first. It often appears calm, even reasonable. Fewer words, short answers. A quiet retreat into another room or into the television. On the surface, it may seem like an attempt to keep the peace. But inside the relationship, something far more serious is happening. This pattern is known as stonewalling, and it becomes increasingly common in marriages as people grow older. Stonewalling happens when emotional overwhelm turns into withdrawal. After years of tense conversations, criticism, or feeling misunderstood, one partner decides, often unconsciously, that disengaging feels safer than staying present. Instead of risking another argument, they choose silence. Instead of explaining how they feel, they shut the door emotionally. And for the person doing it, it can feel like self-protection. I'm too tired for this. I don't want another fight. It's better if I say nothing. In later life, when energy is limited and stress affects the body more strongly, this response can feel not only logical, but necessary. But what the other partner experiences is very different. Silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like abandonment. It feels like rejection. It feels like being erased. And for couples who have spent decades together, that sense of emotional disappearance can be more painful than open conflict. At least anger still signals engagement. Stonewalling sends a message of indifference. It says, "I'm done trying," even if that's not what the person intends. Many older adults grew up believing that walking away from conflict was the mature thing to do. And taking a break can be healthy if it's done with communication and a return to the conversation. But chronic stonewalling doesn't calm a relationship. It freezes it. Trust erodes because trust requires presence. It requires knowing that when things get uncomfortable, your partner will still show up emotionally. When one person consistently checks out, the marriage slowly loses its sense of safety. Over time, stonewalling teaches both partners to stop reaching for each other. One withdraws because it feels overwhelming. The other stops speaking up because it feels pointless. Conversations become shallow. Important topics are avoided. Emotional intimacy fades, not because love is gone, but because connection feels too risky. And when connection starts to feel risky, couples often miss the most important moments without realizing it. These moments are not big conversations or serious disagreements. They are small, ordinary attempts to connect that happen throughout the day. A comment, a glance, a shared memory. A simple sentence like, "That reminds me of when we first moved here," or "I didn't sleep well last night," or "Can you come sit with me for a minute?" These moments are known as bids for connection. They are invitations, not demands, not complaints. Just small ways of saying, "See me, be with me for a moment." In long marriages, especially in older age, these bids become incredibly important because daily life is quieter. Children are grown. Social circles may be smaller. Health may limit activities. For many seniors, their spouse is their primary emotional companion. And these small bids are how closeness is maintained. The way couples respond to these bids quietly determines the emotional climate of the marriage. When a bid is met with attention, even briefly, it builds connection. When it's ignored, dismissed, or met with irritation, it creates distance. And the painful part is that these moments often seem insignificant at the time. One ignored comment doesn't feel like a big deal. One distracted response doesn't seem harmful. But over years, they accumulate. Imagine reaching out again and again, only to be met with silence or distraction. Eventually, most people stop trying. They stop sharing small thoughts. They stop inviting closeness. Not because they don't care, but because rejection hurts more than loneliness. In later life, when emotional resilience may already be lower, repeated missed bids can quietly end a marriage long before anyone talks about separation. What makes this pattern especially heartbreaking is that many couples still live together, still function as partners, still share responsibilities. From the outside, everything looks stable. But inside, the emotional bond has thinned. Conversations revolve around logistics. Affection becomes rare. The relationship feels more like coexistence than companionship. And here's something many people don't realize. Ignoring bids for connection doesn't usually come from cruelty. It comes from exhaustion, from distraction, from pain that hasn't been addressed. When a person has learned that conversations often turn into criticism, contempt, defensiveness, or withdrawal, they protect themselves by disengaging. They may not even notice that their spouse is reaching out. Emotional numbness can feel safer than emotional risk. This is where all of these patterns begin to weave together. Harsh beginnings teach people to brace themselves. Contempt teaches them they're not respected. Defensiveness blocks understanding. Stonewalling removes presence. Ignored bids remove hope. Each pattern reinforces the next, creating a cycle that becomes harder to break the longer it continues. Yet even here, there is something quietly powerful worth noticing. The couples who remain emotionally close in old age are not the ones who never experience these patterns. They are the ones who learn to interrupt them. They learn to slow down when emotions rise. They learn to soften their tone, even when frustrated. They learn to stay present a little longer, even when it felt uncomfortable. And most importantly, they learn to respond to each other's small attempts at connection, even on days when they felt tired or distracted. This doesn't require perfection. No marriage sustains constant attentiveness. What matters is consistency over time, turning toward each other often enough that both partners feel seen, staying emotionally available often enough that trust can breathe, allowing room for repair when mistakes happen, because they always do. As people age, time takes on a different meaning. Regrets feel heavier, moments feel more valuable. Many older couples look back and wish they had understood sooner how much those small daily interactions mattered. Not the vacations, not the milestones, but the ordinary moments when one person reached out and the other responded. And as this understanding settles in, it naturally leads to a deeper question. If these patterns can quietly unravel a marriage over time, what is it that holds one together? What allows some couples to grow closer with age instead of drifting apart? What creates resilience after decades of shared life, loss, and change? The answer isn't dramatic. It doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect communication. It lives in something much quieter, something woven through every interaction, shaping whether a marriage feels safe, valued, and alive, even in the later chapters of life. What truly holds a marriage together in old age is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of goodwill. It's the emotional foundation that allows two people to weather misunderstandings without losing each other. When goodwill is strong, mistakes don't feel fatal. A sharp tone can be repaired. A misunderstood comment can be clarified. A moment of distance doesn't immediately feel like abandonment. But when goodwill is depleted, even small missteps can feel unbearable. This is the common thread behind all 5 of the patterns we've been talking about. Harsh beginnings, contempt, defensiveness, emotional withdrawal, and ignored attempts at connection all drain that foundation. They don't destroy a marriage overnight. They weaken it slowly, quietly, through repetition. And because they happen in ordinary moments, many couples don't recognize the danger until the emotional distance feels too wide to cross. The couples who grow closer with age do something different. Not perfectly, not constantly, but intentionally. They repair. They notice when they've hurt each other, and they try again. They soften their approach when bringing up difficult topics, especially when emotions are already high. They choose words that express feelings instead of accusations. This doesn't mean swallowing frustration. It means expressing it in a way that invites understanding instead of defense. They also work against contempt by practicing appreciation, even when it doesn't come naturally. Long marriages accumulate disappointments, but they also accumulate shared history. Couples who last learn to remind themselves of the good, not as denial, but as balance. They speak with respect, especially in moments of irritation. They remember that the person across from them has shared decades of life, sacrifice, and change. Respect becomes a choice, not just a feeling. Responsibility plays a quiet but powerful role as well. Instead of immediately defending themselves, these couples pause and ask, is there something true here? Even taking responsibility for a small part of a problem can shift the entire emotional tone of a conversation. It tells your partner that their feelings matter, that you're willing to look at yourself, that you care more about connection than being right. Presence is another essential element. Staying emotionally present during discomfort is difficult at any age, but especially later in life when stress and fatigue hit harder. Yet couples who remain connected learn how to take space without disappearing. They communicate the need for a pause and return when they're calmer. They don't leave their partner guessing whether the conversation or the relationship has ended. This kind of presence builds trust, even during conflict. And perhaps most importantly, they turn toward each other in the small moments. When one partner comments on the weather, shares a memory, mentions a worry, or reaches out physically, the other responds in some way. It doesn't have to be long or profound. A glance, a word, a touch. These responses say, I see you, I'm here. Over time, these small acknowledgments create emotional safety. They make the relationship feel alive instead of stagnant. Many older couples underestimate the power of these small interactions. They think the important work of marriage is behind them. But in reality, the later years are when emotional presence matters most. Children are gone. Roles change. Bodies change. Loss becomes more frequent. In this season of life, companionship is not a luxury. It's a lifeline. If you're listening to this and recognizing some of these patterns in your own marriage, it's important to approach that realization with kindness toward yourself. These habits don't form because people are bad or uncaring. They form because life is hard, because pain goes unspoken, because no one taught us better ways. Awareness is not an accusation, it's an invitation. You don't need to fix everything at once. Change often begins with noticing. Noticing the tone you use when you're tired. Noticing the eye roll that slips out automatically. Noticing the moment you want to shut down and choosing to stay just a little longer. Noticing the small bid for connection and responding, even briefly. These moments may feel insignificant, but they are the building blocks of emotional closeness. It's also important to remember that you can only control your own behavior. Waiting for your spouse to change first often leads to more frustration. But when one person begins to soften, to take responsibility, to stay present, it often shifts the dynamic in ways that feel surprising. Not always immediately, and not always perfectly, but gradually. If your marriage feels distant right now, that doesn't mean it's broken beyond repair. Emotional connection can be rebuilt, even after years of quiet drift. It starts with choosing presence over withdrawal, curiosity over contempt, and kindness over defensiveness. These choices don't erase the past, but they shape the future. As we grow older, many of us become more aware of how limited time really is. That awareness can bring regret, but it can also bring clarity. There is still time to listen more carefully. Still time to speak more gently. Still time to reach back when your partner reaches for you. The quality of your connection matters more than ever, not because perfection is expected, but because companionship is deeply human. If this message resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Sometimes, simply putting words to what we've been feeling can be the first step toward change. And if you found this helpful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel Strong Elderly Life. We're here to talk honestly about aging, relationships, and how to live these later years with meaning, connection, and dignity. No matter where you are in your marriage right now, remember this. It's not the grand gestures that determine whether a relationship lasts. It's the daily decision to stay emotionally present, to respond instead of ignore, to repair instead of withdraw, to choose each other again and again in the ordinary moments that make up a shared life. Here's to honoring the love you've built and to nurturing it gently and intentionally at every age.